hate to leave anything off, but I want to make sure we have time for interaction as well, is Dr. Damon Williams. In September 2013, he assumed a new role as Senior Vice President for Program, Training, and Youth Development Services for the Boys and Girls Club of America. In this role, he was the Chief Education Officer for the BGC movement, and he leads their national program strategy and strategic outcomes. Prior to joining this organization, he served for 5 years as Associate Vice Chancellor, Vice Provost, and Chief Diversity Officer, and member of the Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And for those of you that know me, know that my master's is from there as well, so I had really like that linkage. Dr. Williams has also lectured and has been a consultant to more than 300 organizations and higher education institutions globally. He is a 4-time scholar in residence at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. He has authored 2 books, Strategic Diversity Leadership, Activating Change and Transformation in Higher Education. The second book is The Chief Diversity Officer, Strategy, Structure, and Change Moment. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan, has master's and bachelor's degrees from Miami University, and he probably will share with you, he also has some Cincinnati connections en route. So I'd like to thank those of you who are in the room. As Dr. Williams has informed him, we also have a big cohort in the pharmacy school, and I believe perhaps the medical school as well, listening in. So let's give him a warm Cincinnati welcome home to Dr. Williams.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here today. I've got the web camera here. I'm going to try not to stray too far away from it. So if I'm hiding back here just a little bit, it's to privilege those who are attending the lecture who are working remotely. As was noted in the introduction, this is a homecoming for me in many ways. As I had an opportunity to grow up in these communities. I was born in Springfield, Ohio. I was raised in Dayton, Ohio, right on the west side, like to say, right where right between the 2 T's in ghetto, where my community was. I like to say I grew up in the rough, and I grew up in communities where the challenges that we see each and every day, whether we're looking at them from a socioeconomic or healthcare or educational or race, ethnicity, or even a gender lens, were the everyday realities of what it meant to live in Dayton. And I had the good fortune to go off to boarding school in Northeast Ohio. So I claimed the northern part of the state as well, the 216, and spent time up in the Cleveland area at Western Reserve Academy in Hudson, Ohio. And it was really at Western Reserve Academy where I started first asking these questions about diversity and inclusion, power and privilege, opportunity and change, culture. The first moments really came then, and had the opportunity to attend Miami University, and was not a Badger or was not a UC student, but my father was a UC alum. And so he actually worked right on Taft Road, right down the road at what was formerly Ohio National Life Insurance. And so I had an opportunity to come to work with him a couple of times. And so for a long, long time, I've been coming down to Cincinnati. But I will say that the last time I was probably here, I was probably somewhere on campus stepping around a party at a social event as a proud member of my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. So I was not here lecturing, and I was not here as a scholar in residence, and it was before the books and before all those things. But Cincinnati was very much a part of my roots in growing up, but it was also a part of my development. And I wanted to call out an individual who was very special to me, had a chance to meet with this morning, Dr. Eric Abercrombie. And Dr. E was the creator of an initiative called the Black Man Think Tank down here at Cincinnati. And it used to educate thousands of us young persons all across, not just the Ohio area, but the entire Midwest region. And he was part of my education and part of my faculty. And I wanted to make sure that I did honor him and honor the contributions that he's made, because he was a person of great vision. And the vision that he had in that think tank event that we were grappling with, those issues in the early 90s, is directly connected to the issues that we see resting before us right here today. What we see in terms of the fact that from a healthcare perspective, Black males are the most likely to die earliest, the most likely to suffer from certain types of preventable diseases, the most likely to be incarcerated, which is a public health challenge, the most likely to be subject to police and community violence, which is also a public health challenge, and the list goes on. And the lecture today is not about black males, it's about diversity and inclusion, which they're a part of and not the entirety of, but I wanted to begin and start the conversation with a piece of that background, and I wanted to make sure I honored him and thanked him for all he had done for me very publicly and the way he's represented this university for a generation of leadership. I stand here before you today not as an expert, but as a student and as a person who is seeking of answers. And for me, those answers always come back to a slide that won't move. There we go, a slide that now moves. And so for me, I believe so much of life as a scholar, so much of life as a leader, so much of life as an educator is about burning questions, right? So what are the burning questions that you have as students? What are the burning questions that you have as faculty members, as administrators, as community members of the University of Cincinnati family? What are the burning questions which define you? What are the burning questions which really drive your life? For me, you see here depicted a couple of those burning questions. The first is, so what is diversity in the 21st century and why is it so important in the economy and in the world we live in today? The second is, how do we engage in a broad agenda of diversity and inclusion without losing sight of unique group needs? So how do we have the broad conversation but not lose sight of the unique needs of women, not lose sight of the unique needs of the LGBTQ community, not lose sight of the unique needs of other types of diverse communities, not to lose sight of the unique needs of white males? How do we have that conversation that is broad and inclusive, but yet at the same time can be pointed and penetrating around the issues that we're trying to address? I was always interested in how do we move strategically forward with these issues. We have the ability to put persons on the moon. We have the ability to crack the human genome. We have the ability to do all kinds of important things, but yet I just heard a story of a local institution here in Cincinnati which told me that their faculty was probably about 90% members of majority groups, not underrepresented groups. So a challenge that's still yet to be cracked. Why can't we strategically crack some of these challenges as we've cracked other challenges that we face? Also, always been very much interested in how do we expand the pipeline and truly expand the opportunity and the number of individuals that are fully prepared and ready to go into our institutions, whether they're going in as undergrads, whether they're going into our institutions as grad students or professional students, or whether they're coming into our institutions as faculty or leaders. A part of that question, a part of that challenge is what led me to step to another place in the continuum of preparation as I now work at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America and have a chance to touch nearly 4,000 clubhouses and touch the experience of nearly 4 million youth around the country and indeed around the world. And then the last question, and this question probably is the one that has driven me the most, is why is all there so about change, and yet when you start to look at the landscape, you see so little change. It feels very traditional. And I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here, because if we really assess where we are as an institution or where we are as a community, we've made tremendous progress in the last decade and 2 decades and 3 decades and 4 decades. But in some ways, that progress feels very glacial. It doesn't feel transformative. It doesn't feel epic. And in some ways, maybe it is transformative and epic. But for those of us who are in that conversation, who are working in that struggle each and every day, it oftentimes feels glacial, no matter what the issue that we're talking about. Whether we're talking about how do we expand diverse participation of men in nursing, whether we expand diverse participation of underrepresented students in pharmacy, whether we're talking about the ways that we engage in culturally competent care for underserved communities, whether we're talking about the ways that we build bridges such that as persons come to first points of contact in healthcare situations, we understand who they are, where they are, and we can meet them where they are to be able to provide the type of care that they deserve and that they need and that our ethics as a community demand. It feels glacial. And so these are the questions that have driven me for years. And so, like any good scholar, I went off and wrote some books, Strategic Diversity Leadership and The Chief Diversity Officer, which were both written as companion books to provide a very credible voice and contribution to the literature around how to advance this discussion forward and how to get things done. There are far greater scholars than I will ever hope to or aspire to be who talk about things like racism and sexism and homophobia and prejudice and all these other different incredibly important issues which set a context, but they oftentimes take you to the well of understanding and don't give you any tools or resources to do anything about it. I'll never forget several years ago, I was fairly early in my career of traveling around the country, and I was at an institution. And I was at this institution, and I came and I had done some of my early writing towards a model of inclusive excellence and change, and it had gone viral and been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times, and I got invited to this institution. And I went into the institution, and I'll never forget, I was getting ready to give my lecture, and there was a member, a very seasoned, legacied, respected leader in the community who had been a staunch champion around issues of diversity for generations of students from the 60s, 70s, all the way through to the early parts of the 2000s. And he saw me, and he saw my bio, and he started talking to me, and he knew he was speaking on the same agenda as me, and he left. He left. And when he left, he came back. And he came back, and he had this tattered notebook. This notebook looked like it might have been around since 1967. He had this tattered notebook, and he gave this incredible flame-throwing lecture and analysis of the issues. And he said that the institution is racist, and it's systematically excluding, and we can't do this because of these blockages. And everything he said was grounded in really something that was linked to something that had a lot of truth to it and authenticity to it. And it was a flamethrower type of lecture. And I'll never forget, there was a student sitting in the front row, and she raised her hand. She couldn't have been more than a first-year student or a sophomore. And she said, "Professor so-and-so," she said, "I hear what you're saying, but what do I do about it?" She said, what do I do about it? And his response was protest and take over a building and, allow yourself to be heard in an act of civil disobedience and engagement in that way. And that is a part of the tactics that we have to move an agenda forward. And what we've seen in the last year is probably more students coming forward and voicing themselves and being a part of a participatory conversation than we have in the last 5 or 6 years. And in some ways, it's been very impressive to see. But there's another piece of it too, which is that's only going to get the conversation so far. And at the end of the day, the more meaty and material work comes on how do you struggle in the context of the institution to move and reframe the institution. It's what my colleague Deborah Meyerson at Stanford University Business School refers to, how do you become a tempered radical? Tempered radical, right? Tempered because you understand you're working in the institutional context. If you're a faculty member getting a check, if you're a staff member getting a check, if you're a student participating and buying into the system of education, but yet radical because each and every day you're trying to give up some of your privilege that you have towards the benefit of something greater. Whether that privilege is you're a full professor or whether that privilege is you are a student and happen to be there, you're giving some of it up. So you're tempered because you're in the system, but you're radical because you're trying to change the system. You're asking the hard question, well, if we haven't hired someone in neuromedicine faculty that is from a Latino background, and we've never been able to hire someone, but yet we have a candidate, and yes, they're not the perfect fit, but we see all the potential for them to be a junior member of our faculty, and we know that the Affordable Health Care Act means that there's going to be more underrepresented groups that require health care than ever before that look like this individual. When we intersect it with the demography and know that Spanish-speaking communities and persons are more likely to be at our doorsteps of health care than ever before, we ask that, we intersect that, and what we know is that these individuals who are underrepresented are more likely to be in primary care and more likely to serve economic and diverse communities than any other group, then it seems like it starts to rewrite the equation of what potential looks like to be excellent and to produce an excellent graduate in the 21st century. It starts to change the question and reframe the dialogue in many ways. And so as a temper radical, are you asking that question or are you not? So these are the types of questions that I tried to write about in my book in different ways. Because what I feel and what I know is that the conversation of diversity and inclusion, it used to be simply a conversation of doing the morally right thing to do. doing the thing that was in service of social justice, doing the things that we had to do to continue to create a more just and inclusive and right citizenship in country and nation. Those things still hold true. But in addition to that, just beyond that, we also know that the conversation is expanding. And it's been quickened by these forces that I talk about as these strategic forces that have elevated the diversity conversation. You know, it's kind of like the Drake song, started from the bottom, now we're here. Started from the bottom, now the whole community's here. As we look forward and look at what's getting ready to play itself out in the coming elections. The coming elections are not about Republicans and Democrats. The coming election is about diversity. It's about race and ethnicity. It's about economic background. It's about diversity of religion. It's about global and domestic. It's about all these things coming together in this perfect context, this perfect crucible that we call America, to determine who will become the next leader of our country. And all that's wrapped up in that is diversity. And so the conversation of these issues starts to elevate. Whether we're talking about it in terms of changing demographics and educational trends, and we know what those demographics look like. We know what the demographics of Cincinnati looks like in the K through 12 school system. We know what the demographics look like in every major city across this country. And we also know what the educational performance looks like when you start to look at the differentials. And at the same time, we know that what we're talking about is how do we as a healthcare community and how we as an institution prepare ourselves to engage all of these issues in the 21st century, and how does that happen inside and outside of the classroom? How does that happen in our research agendas and our administrative practices? And that's what I've always tried to be focused into. So much of this is about reframing the conversation, right? Not just a moral or socially responsible thing to do. That diversity and inclusion in the 21st century is about mission fulfillment, preparing the next generation of culturally competent healthcare providers. More than just body count diversity. How are people thriving and winning inside of the institution? Whether we're looking at it from the perspective of women and their representation at the full professoriate level across all disciplines, or are they tilted towards the nursing field? Are they equally represented in nursing as they are in engineering, as they are in the business school, or are they tilted towards certain other communities? So how do we achieve full participation? And so this is the conversation in a 21st century reality, and a piece that I think is particularly important for a place like Cincinnati. And I talked about it a little bit this morning with your leadership. How do we continue to engage a conversation of race and ethnicity and a historic lack of representation of brown folks in a place like Cincinnati, where we oftentimes have this black and white dichotomy? How do we continue to privilege that conversation, but yet understand that other conversations have to also be privileged as well? And that the conversation has to embrace that complexity, not run from it. Because each of us brings so many different things. I stand here before you not a first-generation college student, a second-generation college student. I stand here before you as someone who is the beneficiary of millions of dollars of education. I stand here before you as someone who is very well compensated to do the things that I do, as my wife is, as my family is. But I also stand here as someone who's been subject to what it means to drive while black and to be stopped and pulled over. I stand here as someone who's been stopped and held up in stores just because of the race and ethnicity and the biology that I was given in this world when I came into it. So we all bring so many diverse identities, whether it's heteronormative or something else. And so how do we understand those privileges? Because one of the things I found, and it's the first picture that I have in my deck, is this idea of a squirrel and a bear. And I have the squirrel and the bear up here because I think so much of this work is perceived to be about the bear. We need $1 billion to diversify the faculty. We'd have to come with this amazing new study to understand the climate of inclusion. We have to get a board of trustee level authorization to have a new diversity plan. And if none of those things happen, we can't move forward. I would say this. A, you do need money, and I'm going to talk about that. B, you do need high-level senior leadership. That is critical. C, you must have some type of a plan, because without a plan, you oftentimes don't get actioned, definitely in a definitive type of way. But it's not just about the bear. It's also about the squirrel. It's about the small things. It's about the ways that we understand our privilege and give up a little bit of it so someone else can have more in their life. I'll never forget that I was at a university in California, and there was a student, a beautiful student, who stood up, and he was male, and he had kind of bluish-green eyeshadow, and his fingernails were painted, and he had some spiky hair, and he was ethnically ambiguous, and he stood up and said, "Dr. Williams, I love this lecture that you're giving. I appreciate what you're saying." He said, "But I don't consider myself to be a man or a woman. I don't even consider myself to be classically defined by racial or ethnic descriptions." He said, "I consider myself to be the freak." That was his language, not mine. And so he asked me a question. And the question he asked me was tied into this theme of the squirrel. The question he asked me is, have you ever mentored someone that didn't look like you? Have you ever shown kindness and went above and beyond the traditional? As my colleague Daryl Smith of the Claremont Graduate School refers to, interrupted the usual way that you do things in the service of someone else. As a white male, have you mentored someone who's a woman? As a woman, have you mentored someone who maybe comes from a different race ethnicity than you? Have you reached out and brought somebody into your research team, inviting them to join the team who was obviously ascribing to some different type of identity? And so in that is something very small. It's something very small, and it's something very individual. And so as we talk about the imperatives of what the work means, the imperatives are both the larger things that are strategic, but the individual things that directly link to actions and behaviors on a day-to-day basis. When we talk about diversity, right, and we define diversity, I see so many instances where there's these identities that are crashing against one another, and the definitions of diversity oftentimes become the cover for diversity conflict on who's going to control the agenda, right? So if we put in this group and that group and this group and that group, do we water down the agenda too much for an African-American agenda? If we include women in this context, are we not then talking about what it means around heterogeneity and normative privileges that exist in that way? If we don't put disability in it, does that mean they're not a part of the discussion? I was the chief diversity officer at the University of Wisconsin, and one of the things that is very big at Wisconsin is Wisconsin Badger football, right? Now, it's not like Ohio State football. We're talking about it in terms of national championships, or Michigan football is national championships. At Wisconsin, it was Rose Bowls, right? Rose Bowls, right? We don't win national championships at Wisconsin. We just win Rose Bowls, right? So it was Rose Bowls, and it was all football. And so what I realized when I first got there is that when I start talking about diversity issues, if I didn't say race, ethnicity, sexuality, nationality, internationality, economic background, heterogeneity, and all the other different ways that we could talk about diversity, they would reach into their back pocket and someone in the room would say, "I throw the yellow penalty flag on Vice Provost Williams for not saying workplace diversity." Or "I throw the flag on him for not saying this group." And so in that, I started talking about flag throwing. Because I think a part of the imperatives of how we truly move forward is we have to be generous and we have to be humble to allow lots of folks to enter into a conversation, whether you have the perfect language or not. And so I'm talking about the person that's sitting in the room that feels like they want to join the conversation, but if they don't say the perfect right thing, they're going to be attacked by the moral authority of diversity. And they're going to get the flag thrown. Don't do that. Don't do that. That oftentimes is about self-aggrandizing self, not about getting to a higher plane. The thing that I say in this work is nothing matters more than winning. I want the outcome. I want to change. I want to see something different. One of the things we talk about at the Boys and Girls Clubs of America when we are designing change strategies, we talk about what's the from to. What is the from to? Inside of that from to, it's not talking about a definition. Inside of that from to is having a framework and having goals that are linked to different parts of the framework. This is a strategic diversity leadership framework of diversity that I wrote about extensively. So when I talk about diversity, I define it broadly. But when I'm really getting down to the meat of it, I'm laying out the framework and I'm asking what are the strategic goals within each of these different dimensions. Access and equity, defined simply as getting folks in, elevating them, and getting them out. Whether defined from a race, ethnicity, gender, or other perspective. How do we track and measure it? The second piece, and I'll go deeper in this in a second, How are we preparing all students for a world that's diverse, global, and interconnected? We know that Cincinnati is a segregated city, even yet to this day, as many are. And we know many of our students still come to post-secondary education at the undergrad and grad level, not having had intimate interactions with difference. And there's a cost and an implication of that in underpreparedness for the world we live in today. But it's not just access and getting folks in and the educational pieces, it's also the research and the scholarship. In what ways are we embracing diverse research topics and agendas in the context of our traditional settings to offer new knowledge and new ideas that extend possibility? Huge part of what this means. And then what holds it together in the middle? How do we have a multicultural and inclusive campus environment, right? What does that look like? You know, do we understand the campus climate perceived through the lens of women? Do we understand the campus climate perceived through the lens of individuals who are wheelchair enabled? Do we understand the campus climate perceived through the lens of students who are diverse in myriad of different ways? Do we have data that help us understand it? And more importantly, what are we doing once we have that data? Do we have a cultural center? Do we have spaces of inclusion? Is there a space where lactation can happen for women who are nursing? Are there spaces where prayer and reflection can happen for those who worship in different types of ways? How are we changing and evolving our environments to achieve inclusion? And at the same time, how are we creating learning moments for faculty so that they're not creating hostile, negative, exclusionary spaces? How are we creating learning moments for all students? Every student in the allied health profession arena, every student in the medical school, every student at the University of Cincinnati, not just having a laundry list of courses, but some intentional, essential learning goals that we want to accomplish. Because one of the things that Stephen Covey writes about in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Leaders is we begin the journey with the end in mind, right? And so the end game is to ensure that when you graduate as a nurse, when you graduate as a pharmacist, when you graduate as a radiologist, or whatever the case may be, you are emerging fully ready to handle and embrace the diversity and the realities in which you're going to find yourself. I had this wonderful conversation not too terribly long ago at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, right? And so it was this wonderful celebratory event at the Booth School of Business where one of my dear friends was being acknowledged for his early career leadership. So he was winning the Young Alumni Award for the business school. The CEO of the Year award was being given as well, and the winner for that was from Domino's, and there was another individual who was winning for their work in community and social impact. And so we were at his table, and so we were sitting at his table, and then some other folks come, we got moved to another table. So we were sitting at a table, we didn't know anybody, me and my lovely wife. And we're sitting at the table, and you know, when you're sitting at a table, you're having cocktails, you're eating your appetizer, and you start a conversation, right? And so what's the natural? Oh, well, what brings you here, right? And so tell me about yourself. And you start talking, and you're exchanging, going back and forth, right? And when you do diversity work, and I was still working at Wisconsin at the time, and somebody says, so what do? You kind of have that thought like, should I tell them what I do, or should I not tell them what I do? Should I tell them what I do, or should I not tell them what I do? Should I tell them I'm an academic administrator? Should I say I'm a chief diversity officer? You know, how do I frame this? I don't quite know. So I believe that leaders lead with courage. And so I said, oh, I do diversity work at the university, so on and so forth. And he says, now, students, faculty, staff, my favorite question is this question. If you take nothing else out of this, take this question. He said, what do you do? He said, could you say more? Right? He asked me to say more, and he leaned in. I believe more understanding is the hallmark of more inclusion, more collaboration, and more community. If there's one thing you take, more understanding. It's not about what you say, it's about what you hear, what you understand, and what you can feel, right? So he said, could you say more? So then I was emboldened. I said, oh, of course. So I then said to him, I said, you know, I do this, and I work on creating these learning experiences for students and increasing diversity of students, and so on and so forth, and kind of start walking it through. And he said, I am so happy to hear that. And he said, because I'm a managing partner for a major corporate consulting firm, and he said, we have several challenges related to diversity. And I didn't know there were leaders and there was a commitment on the academic side to do the types of things you're talking about. He said, the first challenge I have is we can't hire enough diverse, historically underrepresented graduates into our consulting practice. We're not finding them. The second thing he said, which was even more unique and interesting to me, is he said, but the ones we're hiring that are just domestic, not necessarily ethnic or racially diverse, what he said was they are not able to interact and collaborate across difference in groups and teams. He said they have no experience with diversity. They have no experiences interacting with anybody who didn't come from a background very similar to themselves. Then he said something else that was even more interesting. He said there's a very powerful difference between them, who are the domestic students we're recruiting, and the international students we're recruiting. He said because the international students are much more embracing of diversity. And then he said something that I just kind of sat back on. He said, but they're also more gritty and resilient. He said they are gritty and resilient because it was so hard for them oftentimes to get to where they are. So there's a persistence and a struggle. You know, and I started thinking, wow. You start seeing folks who come from economically vulnerable backgrounds. You start seeing folks who come from racial and ethnically diverse backgrounds. You oftentimes see some of that same stuff. Gritty and resilient, right? I grew up in the rough. You know, I came from the bottom. You know, I came from this background. I put myself through school. Not that I did these things, but persons say these things all the time, and you start to see it. I had this interesting opportunity to do this research project with the American Association of Medical Colleges on chief diversity officers in academic medicine. And so one of the things I started doing is I started trying to complicate my original theory and original framework by thinking about it from a healthcare context, and started talking about it in terms of diversifying the health professions, providing culturally competent healthcare, and educating culturally competent healthcare providers, working to eliminate health disparity, whether in our research or our community engagement work, and then last and not least, how do we create inclusive environments in our academic health-related context. So a very similar model, but yet complicated just a little bit for this environment. At the end of the day, I believe that so much of this conversation is about 21st century leadership. 21st century leadership. And how are we creating intentional learning environments, and how are we as students seeking out those learning environments that are going to allow us to develop the types of skills that we need to win. One is ideation and problem solving. Can you ideate and problem solve against a challenge? One of the things that we've seen through the research over and over again is that diverse groups who are also very talented when it comes to the challenge of problem solving trump over and over again non-diverse groups who are very talented. Scott Page has this wonderful book that he writes called Difference, and he's at the University of Michigan Business School, and he's done a series of experimental design studies. And what we see again is that talent and diversity trumps talent absent diversity. And so we know that when there's more diversity in groups, there's more dissonance oftentimes. When there's more dissonance, means you're looking at the world from more different perspectives. And when you put more perspectives on a common challenge, then you crack the human genome. Then you hack the problem that's in front of you. Then you get to the bigger solution. And so how are we creating context that allows for ideation and problem solving? Another piece to this I think that is so important is digital literacy. Digital literacy. And this is a major priority of where we're going with Boys and Girls Clubs of America, is how do we create a generation of experiences that help young people in clubs to become more digitally literate. When you're digitally literate, you don't just use technology to voyeur, bully, and observe. You use technology to create, collaborate, lead, and inspire. Create, collaborate, lead, and inspire. And so as we think about the information technologies that we have, in what ways are we helping our students to be digitally literate, that they can communicate at high levels in written and oral forms, that they're able to lead and follow in teams, and that's important, leading and following in teams. And then last and definitely not least, and it's the subject that brought us here today, was how are we inspiring possibilities by folks being culturally competent. And what does that word cultural competence mean? You know, does it mean you've memorized every single thing about Native persons? Does it mean that you know whether to say African, Afro, Black, or Negro? What does it mean to be culturally competent? I think what it fundamentally means to be culturally competent is to have an ability to very simply look at the world from another's perspective and try to have empathy for that perspective. To look at the world from another's perspective and to try to have empathy for that perspective. And then try to put that in action in a way that is generous and is focused on understanding. Very simply. You know, so much of what we're about in our experience, we'll spend time at work and we'll spend time in our professions. And, you know, one of the things I am a deep believer in is that my hope for every student, whether we're talking about a pre-collegiate student or we're talking about a collegiate or we're talking about a student who's in the highest levels of professional development and practice as a doctoral student or a postdoc or whatever the case may be, is that they have a clear sense of their passion, what their North Star purpose is, that they have a dogged commitment and focus on maximizing their potential, and that they every day are trying to put the pathways together to understand how to navigate to achieve their goals, their hopes, and their dreams. I recently wrote this document called More, simply called More, and it's my leadership manifesto. It's my declarations for what I believe and what I stand for, and it's the outcome of thinking about my passion, my purpose, one to be committed to maximize the potential and trying to find those pathways. And after you understand that piece of what you're passionate about, you know, it's funny, I'm sitting here talking with the audience primarily in the healthcare arena. I'll never forget when I was a student graduating from high school, and I did the Horizons in Medicine program at Wright State University, which is a program that was designed to diversify the health professions that Wright State still to this day has in place. I did the program. It was a 6-week experience where we were learning medical terminology and a 6-week experience where I was doing a internship in the hospital. So I was a patient transport technician. And I'm telling you, I got good by about the 4th week. Well, I could push that bloody thing, and I have the IV, and I'd have the other monitor, and I'm coming down the hallway, and I got really good. And the only reason I thought I wanted to go into healthcare and thought that I wanted to be a physician is because at my boarding school, the kids that were seemingly the most wealthy were the ones who came from those backgrounds. You know, I was ruined forever when I took my first ride in a Porsche at 15 years old. It was over for me after that. I was ruined forever. And the young man, his father was an ear surgeon who had created a proprietary technique, and he was getting royalties every time his equipment was used. And I kind of learned about this. I was like, man, I don't know what you heard, but this medical thing seems like something. And so, you know, being someone who wasn't first generation, but still hadn't seen and been exposed to a lot of different professional opportunities, that seemed to me like the pathway to the good life. And so I was going to do this program. So I did the program. And I'll never forget going to the burn unit and the smell of pain, the sound of pain, you know, really got me thinking about what does it really mean to be a healthcare provider? And is this where I have passion for? I never remember, you know, I taking those science courses and thinking to myself, I can do it, but do I like doing it? Do I want to do it? Do I embrace it? Am I passionate about it? You know, oftentimes when I give a different type of lecture and I'm talking specifically about these topics, you know, I'll talk about this idea of embracing the brutal facts of your reality, right? If you're not passionate about those things, if you don't want that life, then you probably don't want this opportunity, and no amount of money is going to make it better. So I believe it's so important for us to be finding and getting aligned to our passion, purpose, and potential, and then surrounding it with the right experiences, with the right credentials, with the right relationships, and with the right role models. Because it's what we do to get credentials that formally open doors. It's the type of experiences that we have in and outside the classroom. It's the type of relationships that we have in terms of having senior mentors, peer mentors, those that you're mentoring, and then last and definitely not least, it's the degree to which we're role modeling or avoidance modeling pathways, right? And I talk about that a lot. If you see someone doing something you want to do or where you want to be, whether you're talking about navigating a system to become the first woman to be dean of the X, or you're talking about something where you're, in terms of pursuing some different career pathway, it's about role modeling and avoidance modeling. Because I found the quickest pathway to get there is to follow what someone else has done and ultimately being able to crack through to the next level. I want to end with a final slide, then I want to go into some opportunity for Q&A. And this idea of innovating around diversity. Innovating around diversity. There's a wonderful, wonderful book that I am very much celebratory of called The Innovator's DNA. And it was written by some scholars out of the Harvard Business School who studied innovators across sector. So they studied innovators who were in the healthcare industry. They studied innovators in the not-for-profit sector. They studied innovators in the corporate and the education sectors. They studied innovators. And what they found was this kind of 5-part framework of what makes an innovator. And the first thing that they found was that innovators are always questioning the world. So again, thinking about the bear and the squirrel, innovators are just questioning, asking why. Why can't we? What is? How would we? How might? They're questioning. The second thing, innovators don't limit themselves in finding solutions to simply the context that they live in. So from a strategy perspective, it's not that we're only going to benchmark ourselves against institutions that look just like us, urban tier 1 research universities. We're going to benchmark ourselves against any organization, anywhere, anyhow that we see a possibility there. The third thing about innovators is innovators are constantly seeking out spaces where they're with other innovators because it's coming together in community, bringing together the collaborative possibility of a new thought or a new action or a new idea, which is the spark that oftentimes lets innovation happen. Innovators don't just talk about it. Innovators do. They do. They experiment with their curriculum and say, I'm going to rewrite this primary care curriculum in this way because I believe in this. They explore new types of grant opportunities. One of the innovations that I had a great experience in partnering with was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and one of my faculty had an amazing clinical translation center there, Mark Dresner, who is a very well-regarded faculty member in the academic medical world. And we took his model, and then we wrote extension grants, and then built inside it a culturally relevant, community-based translation aspect to the overall center. And then we created a Health Equity Leadership Institute. And so in this, we built off of something because we were questioning what are we missing. We then used common things that were already there and looked across space and time, and we built something, and then that thing moved out, and now it's raising and generating its own 6- and 7-figure grant opportunities regularly. It's doing amazing work. So they experiment. And once they figure out what works, innovators don't just question. They don't just look for solutions. They don't just engage others. They don't just experiment. Innovators take things and drive them to scale. If you feel like it works, you go big, and you go big fast. But what I found in this framework was that there was a piece around diversity and inclusion that was missing. Because when I looked at all these things, like, yes, these are innovators in the diversity space, definitely. Whether they're innovating on small things or innovating in ways that are very large and very transformative in their size. Innovators in the diversity space also lead with courage. Because it's always cutting against the grain. It's always cutting against the grain. It is never traditionalism with diversity and inclusion. It is always cutting against the grain. It is always being a temperate radical. It is always trying to move forward in many different ways to get something done. The final thing I'll say, because I'm in the great state of Ohio, and we are not at The Ohio State University, but they are just up the road. They are a sister institution in the Ohio system, as I will end as the legendary Frank Hale Jr. used to end all the time, with one statement as it relates to diversity. Commitment without currency is counterfeit. And so when you talk about diversity, you've got to have a commitment of resources to go with it, or else the commitment is counterfeit. Commitment without currency is counterfeit. Thank you so much. I will take questions now. And I've been told that unfortunately the individuals who are simulcasting in cannot ask questions. So the questions are for those of you who are in the room today. Any questions from anyone in the audience? And I do believe in Socratic method, so I will reach into the audience and say, I know you've got a question. Questions, comments from anybody? None? Yes. Mm. Mm. The question for those of you who are timing in through technology was that, yes, it is about courage, but yes, you also have to find communities that can sustain you to be able to stay courageous. And, that for me oftentimes come into finding those spaces with other innovators. Too often what I found is that diversity champions are lone wolves moving forward, trying to get things done. And there's such a toll that takes on your spirit. There's such a toll that takes on your effectiveness. There's such a toll that takes on really meaningful being able to get something done. You've got to find those spaces. But there's another part of it too. Being an innovator and leading courageous doesn't all mean that you're coming out guns blazing on every single issue. One of the things I always run every risk I'm taking through is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Is the outcome worth the capital I'm going to have to invest to get it? And there are times when being strategic in your efforts means less is more. Less is more. You step back, you fall back. One of the areas of literature that I spend a lot of time looking at for a number of reasons is around donor cultivation, right? Donor cultivation. And I had a good opportunity to spend time with UC's executive team this morning, many of them obviously involved in donor cultivation. In donor cultivation, you will begin the conversation, let's say, with a high prospect alum of the institution and say, hey, my name is so-and-so, I'm the new dean. Then you send them another note, hey, I'll be in your area, I'd love to do lunch. Then after that, you send them a follow-up Christmas card, which talks about what's going on at the school. Then you maybe send them a report. Then you put in some call that's saying, hey, we'd love for you to maybe come over and see something. And then it's, hey, we'd love to host you at the football game. Then it's, hey, we're going to be at the Final Four and we're going to have a special reception. We got this special package. Would you be interested? Then it's, hey, we're going to be in your community with our Rhodes Scholar who just graduated. She'd love to meet you. Then it's, hey, I got this idea I'd love to talk about. Would you like to help me with it? And then if all goes well, then they write you a big tip, right? Doesn't always happen that easy. Sometimes it goes like this and like that. But what I found with diversity and how to be strategic is sometimes I can't be the emissary of the message as the diversity champion or as the chief diversity officer. I have to cultivate tempered radicals to get them to carry the message to get something done because they're carrying it, right? So it's, hey, Professor so-and-so, I saw that you're chairing the faculty so-and-so. It's, hey, we're trying to get the blah, blah, blah with the It's, hey, we've got Dr. XYZ coming to campus. Might you come to lunch with us? And, hey, I've got this article. Hey, we're taking this trip or we're going to this conference. Would you be, hey, we're creating this action research project on faculty inclusion. I know that you're interested in that research methodology. It's, hey, we're trying to get XYZ done. Would you be a partner in that? You have to cultivate folks to be temperate radicals oftentimes and help them find the pathway to courageous leadership. Other questions from anybody, anywhere? No? All right.
Maybe just one more, Dr. Williams.
Yeah.
Maybe, given your time you spent in Wisconsin and at UConn before that, any best practices you think that leading universities that are really charged that we should emulate here at UC?
Yeah, great question. Data. So in data, a couple different things that become really important. One is I think that institutions should have a regular campus climate research effort that they engage in. Regular doesn't mean every year, but regular. every 2 years, every 3 years, and use that as a part of your scorecard metricing system. Another piece of it is the world we live in today, nearly everything is trackable in our institutional databases, but oftentimes we don't have enough robust information in those data systems to build predictive models to help us understand outcomes and behaviors. So an example of one of the things that we did at Wisconsin is we went in and we tagged a number of different experiences that students were having. So if you were in this leadership program, or if you were in this academic support program, or you were in these various other programs, we tagged them in our data system. So now we could track those students and start to see potential outcomes. That was a low-hanging fruit opportunity. But the biggest thing that we did, which I was so proud of, is we developed a model using the Markov modeling procedure, which is kind of in game theory, and it's based on inference and lots of different things that, as a non-quantoid, is not my area of expertise, but I can connect you to my person who led the study for me. What we found was that undergrad students who completed at minimum 13 credit hours in their first 4 semesters and achieved at least a 2.5 GPA, their graduation rates were always north of 89%, irrespective of their ethnic background, irrespective of their economic background, irrespective of their major. That's what we refer to as a powerful insight. So we had an insight, so then what did it mean? So we then went in and segmented those who hit that threshold versus those who did not. Once we then identified those who did not hit that threshold, we then went in and started to analyze what was the pattern that we saw in the data we had in front of us. And what we found was that there were a set of courses that there was underperformance in, particularly when those courses were taken in combination in the first 3 semesters. And so what that was advisors telling students to take these courses or you won't graduate on time. You won't complete your major on time. But what was happening was specious underperformance. So now we've got a model that we could then build a theory of change off of. So then from there, some of those courses, we redesigned them and made them not 2 courses, made them 3. We also changed our advising protocols to say, hey, what about taking this not just in these 2 semesters, but over the summer and extending out the time? And then most importantly, not taking certain courses in combination. And so the methodology we would always talk about is be the wolf, not the cheetah. The cheetah is just bursting forward and maybe not getting to the end game. The wolf is the most strategic, relentless creature really on the planet in many ways. And so we were trying to create that type of philosophy in the students, but also that type of methodology and how we were advising. And that all came out of data analytics. That's one example. Yes?
So a lot of what I hear you saying, I'm assuming that it's a top-down approach where you have a lot of buy-in from upper administration. So what happens if you see all of this, you recognize it, but a lot of times the theory of getting these things accomplished from the leadership of an institution may present an issue around finance. How do you get a buy-in to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very simply, every institution has what I refer to, and I wrote about this as what I refer to as their dynamic diversity DNA, right? And that DNA is defined by the priorities of senior leadership, the fiscal health of the institution, the diversity infrastructure of the institution, the diversity planning systems and accountability systems and incentive systems of an institution. When an aspect of that DNA evolves or changes, then it recombinates, right? So you get a new president, new provost, new dean, DNA recombinates. Possibilities open up, sometimes possibilities constrict. Those of us who are citizens living in institutions oftentimes live through multiple cycles of seeing this. Right president, right dean comes along, right challenge moment happens on campus, new energy, new protest, new attention, DNA starts to shift, recombinate. Now we can take steps forward. Now we might be able to take leaps forward. When it recombinates in other ways, now what was possible now becomes very limited, right? What I think becomes very important in those moments where the possibilities open up is to make sure we advance aggressively. In those moments where the possibilities are not open and they're limited and constricted, how do you hunker down and try to build pockets of excellence that allow for something great to happen, and how do you try to move and build momentum in that way? Won't move as fast, won't be as high profile. Jim Collins talks about this in his book, Good to Great for the Social Sector. He talks about how sometimes we don't have the ability to advance things very transformatively and aggressively, that's when we find those pockets of excellence, and we build down and we try to make those pockets of excellence as powerful as we can, and then we try to narrative build, and we try to bring in tempered radical energy to get folks to carry it and hold it, and hopefully over time we can elevate it and evolve it. But if I were to tell you that the moments in our institutions are all created equal and you can always move forward, you can always get accountability, you can't. The last thing I would say is you can try to build a rational argument against how you move something forward, right? It's laying the data out. It's bringing in credible thought leaders. It's bringing in influencers from the corporate space. It's bringing in John Pepper, the former CEO of Procter & Gamble, to have him talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion. It's bringing in the senior VP of HR from a local company to talk about what they're looking for. So you can try to create energy and influence it, but at the end of the day, commitment without currency is counterfeit. If you can't get folks to be at a place of commitment where they'll put down currency, they're not really committed, right? And that's sometimes just what it is. Doesn't mean that those of us who want to get great things done stop in the work. We just have to find ways to work it differently. Great question, though. Thank you so much.
So again, I'd just like to thank Dr. Williams on behalf of the entire Academic Health Center. And certainly one take-home point for me was diversity and inclusion is not just the right thing to do, but also it makes us more excellent, makes us stronger. And so certainly appreciate the positive. And we'll have to make sure those 2 books are available in our library as well that you've written. So I just wanted to thank everyone again. If you're a health professional, make sure you've done everything to get CE points. And if you're remotely, just thank you for joining us as well. Thank you.